The Intergalactic Species Classification Summit convened, as it did every galactic standard cycle, in a monument to bureaucratic excess that would have impressed even the most dedicated paper pusher. The station itself was a marvel of engineering overkill, 17 different atmospheric zones, gravity wells that could be adjusted to accommodate everything from gas-based entities to creatures that existed primarily as aggressive mathematical equations, and enough redundant safety protocols to choke a supernova. Today's agenda item seemed deceptively simple, cataloging apex predators across member worlds. Because apparently, when you've solved faster-than-light travel, conquered entropy, and figured out how to make decent coffee in zero gravity, the next logical step is creating the galaxy's most comprehensive list of things that eat other things really, really well. The delegates had arranged themselves in what could generously be called a circle, if circles could be three-dimensional and account for species that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. The Zephyrian ambassador floated in a containment field that occasionally sparked with what looked suspiciously like poorly suppressed irritation. The Chronite delegation had positioned their crystalline forms to catch the artificial sunlight just so, because even in serious diplomatic proceedings, presentation mattered. At the far end sat the representative from the Terran Federation, a designation that fooled absolutely no one. Everyone knew Terran Federation was just a fancy way of saying those weird bipeds from the mudball in the unfashionable end of the Orion arm. The human delegate sat in what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary chair, looking perfectly ordinary in every respect, which somehow made her the most unsettling presence in the room. The overseer, a being that resembled what would happen if bureaucratic procedures achieved sentience and decided to inhabit a filing cabinet, called the session to order with all the enthusiasm of someone reading tax code. We shall now commence the formal classification proceedings. Each species will present their homeworld's apex predator for official documentation and threat assessment. The phrase threat assessment hung in the recycled air like a particularly ominous party balloon. After all, what was the point of cataloging the galaxy's most dangerous creatures if you weren't going to rank them, categorize them, and ultimately use that information to avoid vacation destinations where you might end up as something's lunch? Agent Vex, for that was indeed her name, chosen specifically because it sounded appropriately mysterious while being mercifully short on paperwork, settled back in her chair and prepared to be entertained. The other delegates had been eyeing her with the sort of polite condescension typically reserved for children who insisted on explaining quantum mechanics using finger paints. She'd grown quite fond of that look over the years. It made what came next so much more satisfying. The crystalline hive mind delegation went first, naturally. They always went first. Something about their collective consciousness apparently made them constitutionally incapable of waiting their turn, as if patience was a concept that simply didn't translate across their neural network. Our homeworld's apex predator, they announced in perfect harmony, their voices creating harmonics that made the translator units whine in protest, is the living mountain of Shard Song Prime. These creatures exist as geological formations that hunt across tectonic plates, consuming entire ecosystems over millennial timescales. The holographic display materialized above the conference table, showing what appeared to be a mountain range casually relocating itself to eat a forest. The image was accompanied by statistics that scrolled past in 17 different languages, all of which seemed to agree that living mountains were impressively large, impressively old, and impressively interested in making everything else significantly less alive. Fascinating, murmured the Void Swimmer representative, though their tone suggested they found it about as fascinating as watching paint dry in a vacuum. Our contribution to this catalogue would be the nth dimensional terror spawn of the deep between. The hologram shifted, and reality seemed to develop a mild headache. The creature, if creature was even the right word, appeared to exist in several states of being simultaneously, none of which looked particularly interested in following the conventional laws of physics. It was the sort of entity that made quantum uncertainty principles throw up their hands and declare themselves inadequate to the task. Terror spawn, the void swimmer continued with obvious pride, exist partially outside conventional space-time and feed on the concept of fear itself. They have been known to cause entire star systems to develop collective anxiety disorders. Agent Vex watched the display with interest, making notes in a small leather-bound notebook that looked absurdly primitive compared to the advanced holographic interfaces everyone else was using. Several delegates had noticed this and exchanged the sort of glances typically reserved for watching someone attempt to perform brain surgery with a butter knife. The presentations continued in escalating absurdity. The methane breathers contributed something that resembled a living hurricane with anger management issues. The silicon-based collective offered up a creature that was apparently so mathematically complex it existed as a proof theorem and occasionally ate space-time to solve for X. The representatives from the scorching wastes proudly displayed something that looked like concentrated hatred, had learned to walk and decided to major in molecular dissolution. Each presentation was accompanied by increasingly elaborate statistics, holographic demonstrations that bent local reality, and the sort of scientific jargon that suggested these creatures didn't just kill things, they did it with style, panache, and probably peer-reviewed publications. Through it all, Agent Vex continued taking notes in her little book, occasionally nodding as if she found the proceedings mildly educational. The condescension from her fellow delegates had evolved from polite dismissal to barely concealed pity. Poor humans, they seemed to think. What could a species barely out of their Stone Age possibly contribute to this showcase of evolutionary excellence? The overseer's attention finally turned to the human delegation, and the ambient temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Not literally, of course. The environmental controls were far too sophisticated for that, but there was definitely a shift in atmospheric pressure that had nothing to do with life support systems. And now, the overseer announced with the sort of tone typically reserved for discussing minor clerical errors, "We come to the representative from Earth." Was it? "We understand your species has had some interesting encounters with what you call wildlife. Perhaps you could share your homeworld's most dangerous predator for our records." The question hung in the recycled air like a challenge wrapped in bureaucratic politeness. Around the room, delegates settled back in their various forms of seating, prepared to be mildly entertained by whatever quaint creature the humans had managed to produce. Perhaps it would be one of those striped felines they'd heard about, or maybe those aquatic creatures with the impressive dental arrangements. Agent Vex closed her notebook with a soft snap that somehow managed to sound like a gunshot in the suddenly quiet chamber. She stood slowly, deliberately, and for the first time since the proceedings began, she smiled. It wasn't a particularly large smile. It didn't reveal any unusual dental work or suggest hidden fangs. It was by all objective measures a perfectly ordinary human expression of mild amusement. Somehow, this made it absolutely terrifying. "Well," she said, her voice carrying the sort of casual confidence typically associated with people who've never met a problem they couldn't solve with sufficient application of stubborn determination, "that's an interesting question." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the assembled delegates, each representing species that had conquered their homeworlds, mastered faster-than-light travel, and considered themselves the pinnacle of evolutionary achievement. Then she raised her hand, Earth's apex predator, she announced, with the sort of cheerful matter-of-factness usually reserved for discussing the weather, would be us, humans. The silence that followed could have been bottled and sold as a weapon of mass destruction. It was the sort of silence that suggested everyone present was trying very hard to process information that didn't quite fit into their preconceived categories. The crystalline hive mind was the first to recover. "Surely you jest," they harmonized, though their collective voice carried a note of uncertainty that suggested they weren't entirely sure what jesting was, let alone whether this qualified. Humans are, well, humans. Small, soft, barely out of their atmospheric gravity. Well, what possible threat could... "Oh, I'm so glad you asked," Agent Vex interrupted, and her smile widened just enough to suggest she'd been hoping someone would bring this up. "Let me walk you through the specifications." She didn't consult any notes, didn't pull up holographic displays or present statistical analyses. She simply stood there, hands clasped behind her back, and began to speak with the casual confidence of someone reciting basic facts about gravity or the speed of light. "Humans are persistence predators," she began, and something about the way she said persistence made it sound less like a hunting strategy and more like a cosmic inevitability. "We're not the fastest, strongest, or most armored predators on our world. We're not even the smartest, if you measure intelligence by raw processing power. What we are, however, is relentless." The word relentless seemed to echo in the chamber longer than physics would strictly allow. See, most predators on Earth, and I suspect throughout the galaxy, operate on what you might call the sprint model. High energy expenditure, quick strikes, immediate results, very efficient, very elegant. Humans, on the other hand, developed what we like to call the long game. Agent Vex began to pace, not with any apparent nervous energy, but with the casual, measured gait of someone who had walked very long distances and intended to walk many more. "We don't run faster than our prey, we just run longer, and longer, and longer, until whatever we're chasing finally collapses from exhaustion, and we just walk up and finish the job." Early humans could run down horses this way. Horses, animals specifically evolved for running away from things. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably. The concept was beginning to penetrate their assumptions about effective predation strategies. "But that's just the physical aspect," Vex continued, warming to her theme. "The really interesting part is psychological. Humans don't just hunt animals. We hunt concepts. We see a problem, any problem, and we just keep working on it until it stops being a problem." She stopped pacing and fixed her attention on the Void Swimmer representative. "Your Terra spawn feed on fear, correct? Fascinating adaptation. Humans, when confronted with something that should rightfully terrify them, have a documented tendency to poke it with sticks until they understand how it works. Then they build better sticks." The holographic displays around the room began showing data streams, not about Earth's creatures, but about human expansion patterns throughout the galaxy. The information scrolled past in real-time: colonies, trade routes, exploration vessels, research stations. It was a web of activity that stretched across dozens of star systems and showed no signs of slowing down. "We've been in space for less than 2 centuries, Vex noted conversationally, and we're already neighbors with half the species in this room. Not because we're particularly advanced, but because we saw all those lovely stars up there and thought, you know what? I bet we could figure out how to get there. So we did." The methane breather delegation was studying the displays with what could charitably be described as growing alarm. Their homeworld was clearly marked as being within 3 jumps of the nearest human outpost. The truly beautiful part, Vex continued, and her smile now carried the sort of warmth typically associated with people discussing their favorite hobbies, is that we're not even particularly good at any of this. We're decent at lots of things, but we haven't mastered any single aspect of galactic civilization. We're not the best engineers, the most advanced scientists, or the most efficient administrators. She gestured vaguely at the assembled delegates. But we're here. We figured out how to build ships that don't explode too often, develop translation protocols that work most of the time, and somehow convinced a galactic council to give us a seat at this table. Not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but by being persistently, relentlessly, annoyingly present until everyone just accepted that we belonged here. The overseer's filing cabinet body was making soft mechanical noises that suggested intensive data processing. "Are you suggesting," it said slowly, "that humans represent a threat to galactic stability through persistence?" "Oh, I'm not suggesting anything," Vex replied cheerfully. "I'm just answering your question about Earth's apex predator. Though now that you mention it, I should probably point out that every species in this room has at least one human-operated research station, trade outpost, or diplomatic mission within their sphere of influence." The data displays helpfully highlighted this information in pulsing red markers. The effect was somewhat like watching a star map develop a case of cosmic measles. "We're not trying to be threatening," Vex added, with the sort of innocent sincerity that made the statement roughly 10 times more ominous. "We're just curious, and persistent, and really, really good at figuring out how to get from point A to point B, even when point B is several thousand light-years away, and populated by beings who breathe methane and communicate through mathematical equations." The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet. This one had weight to it, substance, like the moment before a thunderstorm, when the air itself seems to hold its breath. The crystalline hive mind finally spoke, their collective voice noticeably less harmonious than before. "Unprecedented. No species has ever classified itself as its homeworld's apex predator." "Well," Vex said, consulting her notebook for the first time since she'd begun speaking, "that's probably because most species focus on raw physical capabilities. Teeth, claws, venom, that sort of thing. Very traditional thinking." She flipped a page. "Humans took a different approach. We decided that the best way to be an apex predator was to make sure everything else on the planet was working for us, one way or another. Domestication, agriculture, ecosystem management. We basically turned our entire homeworld into a life support system with us at the top of the organizational chart." The implications of this statement began percolating through the assembled delegates like a particularly aggressive form of enlightenment. Species that had spent millennia conquering their homeworlds through superior firepower or evolutionary advantages suddenly found themselves reconsidering the nature of conquest itself. "You're saying," the Void Swimmer representative ventured, "that humans achieved apex predator status through middle management?" "Among other things," Vex agreed. "Though I prefer to think of it as comprehensive resource optimization with long-term sustainability planning. We didn't just want to be the most dangerous thing on our planet. We wanted to be the most dangerous thing on our planet indefinitely." She closed her notebook and tucked it away. "The really interesting part is what happened when we ran out of planet. Turns out, the same strategies work pretty well on a galactic scale. You just need to think bigger and be willing to commute." The overseer was processing this information with the sort of mechanical intensity that suggested several of its primary circuits were approaching their operational limits. This requires significant reconceptualization of our threat assessment protocols. Oh, don't think of it as a threat, Vex said, waving a dismissive hand. Think of it as a consulting opportunity. Humans are really quite reasonable, most of the time. We just happen to be very, very good at getting what we want, and what we want tends to expand over time. The data displays had shifted to show human population growth patterns, both on Earth and throughout the galaxy. The curves were the sort that made statisticians wake up in cold sweats, all exponential growth and aggressive expansion vectors. For instance, Vex continued conversationally, right now we want things like peaceful coexistence, mutually beneficial trade agreements, and comprehensive cultural exchange programs. Very reasonable wants, very achievable through conventional diplomatic channels. She paused, letting the unspoken implications hang in the recycled air like a sword made of pure subtext. Of course, wants have a tendency to evolve over time, but I'm sure that won't be a problem. Humans are remarkably adaptable, and we've gotten quite good at finding creative solutions to interpersonal conflicts. The phrase creative solutions somehow managed to sound more threatening than any of the cosmic horrors that had been presented earlier in the session. The methane breather delegation was frantically consulting what appeared to be an emergency communication device. The silicon-based collective had begun generating mathematical equations at a rate that suggested mild panic. Even the living mountain representatives seemed to be reconsidering their geological timescale approach to existence. Agent Vex surveyed the room with the satisfied expression of someone who had successfully completed a moderately challenging crossword puzzle. So, she said brightly, shall I submit humans for official classification as Earth's apex predator, or did you need additional documentation? The overseer's mechanical processes were making sounds that distinctly resembled a printer having an existential crisis. The classification will be approved. Expedited processing. Highest priority. Wonderful, Vex said, settling back into her chair with every appearance of contentment. I do so enjoy efficient bureaucracy. Around the conference table, delegates were gathering their materials with the sort of hurried efficiency typically associated with people who had suddenly remembered urgent appointments somewhere else. Anywhere else. The session ended with record-breaking speed, as if the assembled representatives had collectively decided that they had pressing matters to attend to in their home systems. Immediately, as the chamber emptied, Agent Vex remained seated, making final notes in her leather-bound book. The last entry, written in neat, precise handwriting, read, "Mission accomplished. Recommend increased funding for diplomatic expansion initiatives. Also suggest upgrading travel accommodations. The atmospheric recyclers on these stations really are quite inferior to Earth standard." She closed the notebook, stood and walked toward the exit with the unhurried pace of someone who had nowhere urgent to be and all the time in the galaxy to get there. Behind her, the holographic displays continued showing human expansion patterns, trade routes and population statistics, painting a picture of a species that had looked at the galaxy and decided it seemed like a nice place to visit, and maybe stick around for a while. After all, humans had always been very good at making themselves at home,